Wade Langston spurred his horse forward across the stretch of land he had just bought from the bank, a barren wilderness where he hoped to start a new life. Quiet and untouched by the shadows of war. But as he crossed the last low ridge, he suddenly yanked the reins tight, his heart seemed to stop. In the vast emptiness ahead, 7 bodies hung suspended from tall wooden posts. Under the pale sunlight, the ropes were drawn taut, swaying gently in the wind as if mocking life itself. Wade leapt from his saddle and sprinted forward. As he got closer, he realized what made his blood run cold. They were still alive. A trembling hand reached up toward the sky. Pale lips parted slightly, pleading for help. Wide eyes flickered with the last glimmer of hope. "Oh God!" Wade rasped, pulling out his knife. He climbed onto the rickety wooden frame and slashed at the ropes frantically. The first body dropped to the ground with a weak, rattling breath. The second one was still breathing. The third had a pulse, all 7 of them still alive. As he cut the final rope, an Apache woman opened her eyes and looked up at him, her cracked lips trembling into a whisper. "They have not won yet." Wade knelt beside the nearest woman, his hand trembling as he pressed his ear close to her mouth. Her breath was faint, like a flame flickering in the wind, but it was still there. He quickly loosened the rope around each of their necks, checked their pulses, then lifted their limp bodies one by one onto his wagon. There was no time to think, no time to be afraid. Only one truth remained. If he hesitated, those 7 lives would vanish forever. The journey back to the ranch felt longer than any day before. Cold wind bit at his face. Red dust coated his clothes, and the faint moans from the back of the wagon squeezed his heart with every mile. By the time he arrived, Wade was no longer just a rancher checking on his land. He had become the bearer of 7 souls caught between life and death. He lit a fire, boiled water, and tore cloth into makeshift bandages. His hands, once familiar with holding a rifle, now fumbled as they touched the bruises on their necks, wiping the dried blood from their bound wrists. Some remained unconscious, others twitched slightly as the warmth began to return to their bodies. "Hang on. You are going to live," Wade murmured, unsure if he was speaking to them or to himself. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, their breathing began to steady. A young woman with long black hair opened her eyes first. Those eyes, deep, sorrowful, and filled with pain, rested on Wade's face. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice like wine through a canyon. "I am the new owner of that land," Wade replied. "What happened to you?" She did not answer right away. Instead, she tried to sit up, her gaze falling to the scratches on her wrist. Tears spilled silently as she spoke. They wanted to teach the world a lesson that Apache women are not allowed to stand up against them. Wade was stunned. He did not need to hear more to understand. The bruises, the ropes, the shame in their eyes all told the story more clearly than any words could. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice growing lower. "The bank, the railroad company, and the proud men in tall hats who think our lives are worth nothing." The room fell into silence. Only the crackling fire and faint breathing could be heard. But inside Wade, another fire had begun to burn, not of pity, but of fury. He did not know exactly what he was stepping into. But one thing he knew for sure, they had survived for a reason, and that reason was now his responsibility. On the second night after their rescue, the fire crackled inside the small wooden cabin. 7 Apache women sat huddled around the stove, hand-woven blankets worn and frayed at the edges draped over their shoulders. Outside, icy wind swept across the empty land. Inside, the silence was heavy. They had remained quiet for days. But now, the truth needed to be spoken. Naira, the eldest with eyes as dark and deep as the desert night, was the one to speak for them all. Her voice was hoarse, but every word dropped like a stone. "We are not criminals. We are daughters of this land. The story began generations ago. Their ancestors had lived on this land long before borders ever existed. In the year 1851, the tribe signed a treaty with the government, recognizing the land of Red Mesa as their traditional and non-transferable territory. They built homes, planted crops, raised livestock, and lived in peace until the white settlers began arriving in search of silver and railroad routes. They came with papers and smiles, Naira said, her eyes fixed on the flames. But when we refused to sell, the smiles vanished. Frontier Bank and the railroad company began their campaign. They declared the treaty no longer valid, hired gunmen to raid their cattle pens, poisoned their water supply, and burned dozens of huts to force the tribe off the land. When the Apache people protested, the local authorities already bought and paid for accused them of occupying public land and obstructing progress. We organized resistance, Naida continued. No weapons, no violence. We built fences around our ancestral land, raised the tribal flag, and sent letters requesting meetings with officials, but they never responded. Instead, they sent soldiers. One night, before the moon had even risen, soldiers and hired guns surrounded the village. They seized every adult woman, exactly 7 of them, dragging them from their homes in the dark. There was no trial, no official charge. Only whips, laughter, and the sentence. Rebels will hang. They wanted to kill our faith, not just our lives, Naira whispered, her voice trembling. They believed that if this generation died, the next would never dare reclaim the land. Wade sat still, his hands clenched into fists. He had seen evil in war, but never had he seen it wear the mask of law so convincingly. There was no doubt anymore. This was not just a land grab. This was a cultural purge. And then Naira looked deep into his eyes. You cut the ropes and we are still alive, which means the fight is not over. Wade nodded. In the flickering firelight, his eyes gleamed like tempered steel. No, it has only just begun. From that night on, Wade's small cabin was no longer just a temporary shelter. It became a base, a fortress, a command post for a war of justice that none of them had ever imagined would return. Wade began investigating the way a man trained by the military would quietly, patiently, and methodically. He rode into the nearest town, listened to stories in saloons, asked questions at the sheriff's office and the printing press, and the deeper he dug, the more everything reeked of deception. At the heart of it all was Frontier Bank, the very bank that had sold the land to investors from Chicago, New York, and San Francisco. But there was something strange. These contracts had been signed over 20 years ago, even before the government declared the area as unclaimed. And most of the signatures supposedly representing the Apache people were forged. They forged history, Wade muttered as he scanned the stack of documents Tala had brought back after sneaking into the bank's lawyer's office. They didn't just steal the land. They built a whole story to justify the theft. But the most chilling evidence came in a thin envelope secretly delivered to Wade by Clarabelle, the youngest daughter of a nearby settler family. Inside was an internal memo between Frontier Bank and the railroad company. When the trade route crosses Red Mesa, land value will increase 20-fold. Indigenous relocation must be completed before Q4 of this year. No court needed. Sheriff has been fully compensated. Wade laid the letter on the table. The room fell silent. The eyes of the Apache women bore into the page as if they could set it ablaze with their fury. They want to wipe out the entire tribe, Naira said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not for land, but to erase our very existence. Then we will show the world that they cannot. Wade replied, his eyes burning bright. But to do that, we need the one thing they fear the most. The truth. They began gathering everything they could, a copy of the 1851 treaty Tala had kept, testimonies from settlers who witnessed the arrests, and a list of illegal land transactions carried out by Frontier Bank. Alun and Roya visited every farmstead, convincing villagers to sign a petition of protest. Sanaa and Takaina searched for surviving Apache elders to provide their testimony. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, and the picture was clear. This was not just land theft. It was a crime orchestrated by corrupt officials. Marshal Davidson in Tucson, Wade said, pulling out a letter the marshal had once sent him during the war. He is the only man I trust. If we get him the evidence, the federal government will have to step in. Naira looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. In her eyes was no longer the suspicion of someone betrayed, but the unshakable trust of a warrior. We will not run anymore, she said. We will stand, and this time we will not fall. I am truly